Let's take a look at the idea that Gospels are written by eyewitnesses. And where should we look? How about one of the Gospels? So, in the introduction for the Gospel according to Luke or St. Luke, it says, "Since many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things fully attested among us, as delivered to us by the original eyewitnesses who became stewards of the word, it seemed good to me also, having meticulously traced everything again from the top, to write it down in sequence for you, O most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the reliability of things you have been told." To me, the "O most excellent Theophilus" pegs it as fiction. It sounds exactly like C.S. Lewis, maybe in the Screw Tape Letters. But regardless, if there is a person named Theophilus and that person received the first draft, fine. But delivered to us by the original eyewitnesses, and then it seemed good to me also. Luke is making it clear that, once again, he's not an eyewitness. Now, if you read it as if this is religious text designed to inspire, designed to place Jesus in the importance that they all feel he should be placed, you can see that stories are changed over the Gospels, which were written Mark first, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. I don't know too many biblical scholars who take issue with those basic assumptions, although no one can date any of them exactly. And also, no one thinks that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are the names of the writers, or that there's even necessarily just one writer. But many of the stories told in Mark are then retold and often cleaned up in Matthew, and sometimes cleaned up again in Luke. So you probably, if you went to church long enough or read the Bible enough, or I guess if you even listened to the album Jesus Christ Superstar, this scene, as told in John, is dramatized in that song called Everything's All Right. It becomes a three-way argument between Mary, in that case, Mary Magdalene, Judas, and then Jesus. But this is the first time we see this story. It's a little bit long here in Mark. So Mark 14, 3 through 9. "And being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at meat," this is the King James Version, so whenever they eat anything, they sat at meat, "there came a woman having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard very precious, and she brake the box and poured it on his head. And there were some that had indignation within themselves, and said, Why was this waste of the ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence, and have been given to the poor. And they murmured against her. And Jesus said, Let her alone. Why trouble ye her? She hath wrought a good work on me. For ye have the poor with you always, and whensoever ye will, ye may do them good. But me ye have not always. She hath done what she could. She is come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her." All right, so let's remember a few key details. Here, the box is alabaster. The name of the woman is not given. The 300 pence, remember that? And to be given to the poor. And who said that? It was just some that had indignation within themselves and said. So some people, I guess, were murmuring. But when we see it again, so this time Matthew doesn't retell that, but Luke does. And if you just read the four Gospels and take notes, you'll see how different they are. Mark doesn't have a story about Jesus' birth. Matthew and Luke do, but they completely contradict each other. There's almost nothing they have in common. But here, I guess Luke saw this in Mark, so that's why most biblical scholars say that both Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, which seems strange if they're both eyewitnesses. Of course, we saw the introduction to Luke, and he said, No, now I'm going to give an account after the eyewitnesses already have. "And behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Hmm. So it's just the Pharisee's house. It is still an alabaster box, but it doesn't say spikenard. Again, I know nothing about spikenard. And this time, nobody complained or mentioned giving the money instead to the poor. It goes into a much different direction after this, which wasn't relevant to what we're looking at. All right, so it comes up again in John. So, as you may know, the first three Gospels are considered to be synoptic. They seem to be on the same basic outline. And then this is off on its own, John. And those are the canonical Gospels. There are several other Gospels that some may be in various church Bibles, and others may call them the Apocrypha. Some may just be out there recently discovered, but there are other Gospels, Gospels of Judas, Gospel of Thomas. That's a sayings Gospel, pretty dull. At least these canonical Gospels have Jesus do things besides just talk. But this is much more close to the song Everything's All Right in Jesus Christ Superstar, where this time it's Mary Magdalene and she's trying to comfort Jesus, who really does need comforting. But Judas comes in and takes her to task for wasting this ointment. We could have raised money for the poor, and that's more important. And then Jesus comes in and argues with Judas. And boy, these are some fine vocalists, all three of them. Jesus is sung by Ian Gillan of Deep Purple. And I don't know what else Alan Doggett, who sang Judas, did, but boy, he did a great job on this. And then Yvonne Elliman is singing the part of Mary Magdalene, and she went on to have at least one hit later in the 70s. No need to go into that. But here in John, then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. No tears, though. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. Then said Jesus, Let her alone. Against the day of my burying hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. So I think that pretty well makes the point that the Gospels are not even pretending to be history or eyewitness accounts or anything like journalism. They're written from theological viewpoints. They share some of the same stories, but as you just saw, we can see the same story here working with quite different details. On two of them, the box is alabaster. Here, you don't care about the box. In two of them, it's spikenard. One of them doesn't mention that. In one of them, nobody complains, but in Mark, it's just some unnamed guests who do. Here, it's Judas Iscariot. And then the author takes his little swipe that he didn't care about the poor. And then he alleges that Judas was somehow a thief and says, because he, I guess, was the treasurer. Obviously, he was stealing. I don't know. But the 300 pence remains the same detail among at least two of them. Strange. Here it's Mary. I don't know. I don't have the rest of the text in front of me. Sometimes that could be Mary Magdalene, or there's a Mary and then her sister Martha. I think they even come back again in that a story of Lazarus being raised from the dead, which only shows up in one of them. But if you let go of the idea that these are eyewitness accounts, then this kind of thing is not even surprising. Mark writes his gospel. Matthew's like, oh, okay, that's pretty good. But Matthew is interested in linking a lot of what he says are prophecies from the Old Testament to what Jesus said or did or what happened because of his birth. Luke seems to be cleaning up some of what Matthew wrote, but like Matthew, he writes a birth narrative. John just says, no, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And a little later, and then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. No need for a birth narrative. Strange. All right, so only one of the women used her tears, but I guess did they all use their hair? Came a woman, break the box, poured it on his head. Yeah, there's nothing about tears or using her hair. Matthew's next, and then Luke. Luke has her. Oh, she's a sinner, and she has tears, and she uses her hair, and she kisses his feet. Nobody complains. And then here's some of those details: wiped his feet with the hair. Nobody says she's a sinner. But now it's a specific character, Judas Iscariot. In some of the Gospels, there's another Judas who's a disciple, but here he makes this charge. Strange. So, same story, three different Gospel authors. All right, now, if you've seen any of Louis C.K.'s stand up, you may have seen that he also goes into the story. And I know that there are theologians and Bible scholars who uh, will take the story of the fig tree and say, well, it really means this, it's symbolic, this refers to that. I don't know what the symbolism is. I just know that based on my background, with a couple of English degrees and teaching experience and some publications, when I see these stories, oh, and I'm also basing it on an excellent book called Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms, who showed me to look at this in a different way, just as story, the similarities and the differences. What the fig tree itself is about, I don't know. Louis C.K. has some pretty funny takes on that. All right, so Mark chapter 11. Noticing a fig tree in leaf, he, Jesus, went to see if he could find anything on it. But when he came there, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to the tree, may no one ever again eat fruit from you. Early next morning, as they passed by, they saw that the fig tree had withered from the roots up. So, yeah, you don't usually picture Jesus cursing anything. But when he went to get figs, I guess he didn't know it wasn't the season. He got mad and he cursed it. That does sound like there's got to be something symbolic going on there. But then by the next morning, when the 12 and Jesus passed by, the fig tree had already been withered because of that curse. All right, then it's retold in Matthew. Seeing a fig tree at the roadside, he went up to it, but found nothing on it but leaves. He said to the tree, you shall never bear fruit any more, and the tree withered away at once. Interesting. So I said Matthew cleans it up a little. How does he clean it up? Well, unlike Mark, Jesus doesn't have to go up there and see what's going on. And also, it doesn't take until the next day for the tree to wither, right? So he sees that the fig tree is in leaf, but he doesn't know enough about agriculture or horticulture. He has to go up there, and that's all he finds. Why doesn't he know it's not the season? I guess he just found out now. But then why is he angry? Again, this has to be symbolism somehow. I don't know exactly. But it takes until the next morning, or they don't know about it until the next morning. I think Matthew wants to make him a little bit smarter and more powerful. I just went up to it. There's nothing but leaves on it. So he isn't wrong about his any assumption. And he curses it, and immediately it dies. Wow. Luke, a certain man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it, but found none. So he said to the vine dresser, look here, for the last 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree without finding any. Cut it down. Why should it go on using up the soil? So you get the sense that Luke didn't really like the character revealed through either Mark or Matthew's version. He still, there must be something powerfully important or symbolic about this fig tree. But here, let's just take it away from having anything to do with the Christ. A certain man. So it reads more like three different ministers telling stories to introduce a sermon. And then maybe they could explain what's this thing about the fig tree. I mean, it really, it just begs to be interpreted in some way. And I'm sure that if I were really interested, I could find some very good stuff from what they would call liberal Christians or mainline Christians who dig into the meaning of, okay, if he walked on the water and calmed the storm, what was the point of that? Well, it really means that the disciples went out without Jesus and immediately, even with just a little bit of wind, got into a bunch of trouble. As soon as they let him back in the boat, everything's calm. Oh, the Bible doesn't have Jesus's 10 greatest miracles in a list. Everything's a story. Presumably, there's a point to these stories. I don't know what the point is of this fig tree. I've seen some explanations, and I've even seen some of the YouTubers kind of back away from wanting to ridicule the story. And I'm not trying to ridicule the story. I just think it's a really good example of Mark uses the story in this manner because in Mark, there's a lot more mystery. The 12 never seem to understand what's going on. You know, it's kind of mysterious. Who is this figure? And even Jesus himself, you know, Mark shows him having to go up and check, and oh wow, you know, it's not exactly what I thought. The curse does work, but it's next day. Hey, let's clean this up a bit. Obviously, you know, Jesus knows that it's not the season for figs, but he still doesn't like the fact that it doesn't bear fruit. And so he curses it, and boom, it dies. And then apparently Luke doesn't like Jesus doing any of this stuff, but he likes the basic idea. So he just says it's a certain man, which is funny because, well, doesn't that mean he's an uncertain man? And it's in a vineyard. It's not Jesus and the 12 going by. But anyway, we've seen two stories told in three different manners among the Gospels. I'm not saying this is the smoking gun, they couldn't have been eyewitnesses. I'm just saying it makes a lot more sense that this would happen. And it happens over and over, including the passion of the Christ and the resurrection scenes, the ascension scenes. They're writers who are writing early Christian text designed to inspire, and they're writing in a time when history almost always included some mythological claims about virgin births and ascending into heaven. I mean, even some of the Roman emperors were said to ascend into heaven at about the same time. What was it? Octavian became Caesar Augustus. He was thought to be ascended into heaven as well. Or even some of the Old Testament claims, and his years on the earth were 864. Wow, he was 864 years old, important. You know, people reading this or hearing these texts knew how mythology was woven in and how what was being presented was the character of Jesus in this case, or of other uh, ancient historical figures. They had very little concern for relating actual stories. And it even continued into some of the early biographies of George Washington. Again, it was a minister. His last name was Weems. And he had to admit later that, oh, no, that story about the cherry tree just made a nice sermon. Well, that's what we're seeing here. The sermon about the fig tree told three different ways, and the sermon or the homily about the woman. And I don't understand what the point is of that, why three gospel writers want Jesus to say, hey, don't give her a hard time. You'll always have the poor with you. Whoa. So, in any case, sometimes Jesus does care for the poor, and sometimes it's more like this. Like and subscribe and all that good stuff.